Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. This week, we will be discussing a couple of important developments that have taken place. India and China finally have agreed upon a 5-point agreement, and we need to see everyone is waiting to see how those points actually translate into deeds. So that's one important thing that we will be looking at and analyzing it. I will be analyzing it with Professor Harsh Pant. Along with that, the intra-Afghan talk that has happened, and India's position and India's participation in those talks, and how did it really play out for India? We'll be looking at that. Along with that, we will also be looking at or actually analyzing a very important book that has come out, Bob Woodward's Rage, before the US election. How will it, or will it really affect Donald Trump's re-election, if I may call it so? So we will look at all of that. Welcome, Harsh, on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Let's look at India-China first. The foreign ministers have met on the sidelines of the SCO in Moscow, after which now all eyes are set on the commander level meeting, and people are waiting to see how significant is this 5-point agreement, which really does not have anything new. If we look at the previous agreements that have already happened and are in place, whether it is the 93, 96, 2005, 2012, or 2013, the border cooperation agreement after the Depsang intrusion by the PLA. So, looking at all of this, how significant is this? And the main question remains, will it translate into deeds? What is different this time?
Naghma, I think that's the million-dollar question, perhaps for everyone in India, because after a lot of setbacks in the Sino-Indian relationship, and after a lot of after an assessment that China is not really serious about moving forward towards a amicable resolution of the boundary issue of the border problem, border tensions, I think there is a glimmer of hope that perhaps this framework would allow some kind of an arrangement to be worked out and some kind of a resolution to this 5-month-old simmering problem. And what India has always been maintaining, that it would require political resolution, and now top political entities, the two foreign ministers of China and India, have met. They have broadly agreed on a framework that, look, the Wuhan spirit, the top engagement between the two leaders, the framework laid out by Chinese president and Indian prime minister needs to be followed. That unilateral changes to status quo should not happen, and that ultimately negotiated settlement is the way forward. So clearly, I think both sides have been trying to at least communicate to each other and to the international community that they remain intent on resolving this amicably. So the question, therefore, now is, as the commander level talks take place, as the operational changes take place, will we see change on the ground? And I think that's the question that perhaps India would be looking at very, very carefully, given the setbacks in the past. Yes. Even before Galvan Valley incident in mid-June, there were negotiations happening, but suddenly you had mid-June crisis. And then suddenly negotiations have been going on ever since then also. But you have had one crisis after another. Entire LAC at one point seemed to be simmering. So I think clearly now the proof of the pudding would be in what happens on the ground, and not really in the rhetoric that is coming out. Because we have seen the rhetoric even from the Chinese foreign minister. It seemed very reasonable. Wang Yi made a statement saying that we are intent on de-escalation. We are intent on working with India to resolve this. But at the same time, there were some signals about adding an addendum to the 5-point charter, for example, where the interpretations were very different. India was saying something and they were saying something. Indian interpretation was very different, and they interpreted it, or they added in the addendum saying that India believes that boundary problem is not central to the larger Sino-Indian relationship, which was exactly contrary to what India has been saying all along. So I think there are enough challenges out there to be managed. But I think given the past experience, perhaps this presents us with a glimmer of hope that something might change.
Yes, yes. And like you say, was it the best that could have actually happened in this situation? It's actually, if you see, the best way forward right now. The tension that is been building up, though, like you said, the proof would be, or the real test would be if the PLA troops start moving back. That's what India really wants, because the troops are facing each other, and uh, whatever happened now is in keeping with the Chinese policy of fighting and talking simultaneously. It was also good optics for the Communist Party to show to the international community how sincere they are in their intent, wasn't it? The test would be if the troops move back.
Yes, and I think, something has also changed on the ground, that India is also not simply relying on negotiations, that India has also been able to outmaneuver Chinese, at least tactically in certain areas. So the Indian military now, is in control of certain heights around the areas
Yes.
around the southern bank of Pangong Lake, which gives them some leverage in the larger negotiations. So I think the question here is, how do you build on that leverage? How do you use that leverage? And perhaps that was the reason why Chinese today seem a bit more mellowed, a bit more, intent on taking this conversation forward compared to, say, a few weeks back, when we had seen a certain belligerence entering into the tone. So my sense is that it's not simply, that you are talking, India and China are talking, and the trajectory of the talks is being determined by actually what is happening on the ground. So negotiations and conflict actually build on each other. Diplomacy and war are two sides of the same coin. So we are also doing something on the ground which is having an
India is
impact.
in a, sorry for interrupting, but in a way, simply if you understand, India is in a better position to talk now. We are talking from a position of strength because of the changes that have taken place on the ground.
Yes, and I think that is, that had to be the policy, because the experience was that Chinese are not budging on the initial demands, right? So when we started off saying that China should restore status quo ante, we did not really have much leverage to convince them that they need to restore the status quo ante. Now we have some leverage. Now the question is whether the Chinese see it as the kind of leverage that we see it, and whether they would be willing to play ball. Indications are that they are doing that. They're changing some of their approach to it towards India, in the negotiating tactics towards India. So perhaps this will move forward in a direction which will be favorable to India. But again, as you say, Chinese have been known to be very, very deceptive. They've been known to be doing several things at the same time. And perhaps we should also be doing the same thing. And I think we are also doing the same thing now. We
Yeah.
are also moving troops, making a larger sort of a chessboard around which we are sort of playing around with our diplomats doing some things, with our military forces doing something. And there is you see an irritation in the Chinese, in the Chinese narrative now about that. How can India do this? That India is now the one that's transgressing. And also some very interesting editorials and comments from the Global Times, for example, saying, oh, international morality, we can defeat India, but what will happen to international morality, as if Chinese ever bothered about that. So I think there is a shift there happening, and perhaps India's ability to maneuver its defense forces to a position of some kind of ground level advantage has made this shift. But again, it's too early to tell.
Too early to tell, and this LSE is not the only area where there is tension growing. There's tension growing also along the Indo-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, in the South China Sea, and the recent pact that India has signed, the Navy pact with Japan, probably is also keeping in mind this threat, the Chinese threat, the aggression in the area, and it is said it's also to strengthen the Quad. Uh, so, can we look at this pact in this context? And how significant is that? It's a 10-year pact, it's a military pact. Shinzo and Abe, summit level talks took place, and then now we having this pact.
I think that whatever happens on the border, it is very clear that India will now take positions on the global stage. India will now take policy positions vis-a-vis China, which will have an explicit anti-China orientation. And I think this uh, there used to be a sense that yes, we need to do certain things about China, or to manage China, but we also need to explain to the Chinese why we are doing that in the past. Now I think that reticence is gone, because and what Chinese have done to India, to Indian interests, and how they have behaved. So while border resolution will happen, it might lead to some kind of a resolution in the short to medium term. But I think the larger trajectory of Sino-Indian relationship will remain very, very conflictual, if I may use the word, and
Mhm.
also devoid of any real trust. I think going forward, at the back of our minds would always be this question: Can we trust what the Chinese are saying? And I don't think Indian policymakers will ever be in a position
And which is a
to
question which
trust
the
what.
world is asking now.
Absolutely, and this is exactly the point that you were making, that this is happening in a larger context, where everyone is asking this question in some way or another about Chinese intentions. And India, it seems to be one country which is feeling it much more directly, given that we have had a long border dispute. We have one of the longest border disputes, in recent past, and we have been trying to manage it with some degree of difficulty in the past as well. But the idea was that we can manage border, at the same time we can manage trade and other relations with China. I don't think that paradigm works anymore, and therefore India's outreach to countries which are like-minded, which perhaps can give India some leverage in the larger Indo-Pacific, is going to be much more substantive. And in that context, we should look at the Japanese Logistics Pact. And I think more of such pacts are coming. We have already have these pacts with with the Americans, with Australians, with France, and I think there are reports about such pacts being in the works with countries like UK, Vietnam, Russia. So I think we are looking at a larger context of the Indo-Pacific. It's not simply about the border. Border is one part of our larger relationship with China, which is becoming very, very difficult to handle, given that our leverage vis-a-vis China have been so very limited. And I think that's what we are trying to develop at this point. And it just so happens that other countries are also doing the same thing. Other like-minded countries are also doing the same thing. So we see that reciprocation happening between countries like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, France, America, and India. And that, I think, is going to be the future of this engagement. And what this logistics pact also does, it in some ways strengthens the Quad, because India already has such pacts with Australia and US. So now with Japan, we almost have the entire quadrilateral in place, where we can use each other's, we can access each other's logistics facilities, military bases, ports, and that would allow for a larger mapping of our military positioning, naval positioning across the Indo-Pacific, which has always been the intent. And I'm sure Chinese are not going to look at it very positively, but I'm sure they would understand India's position, why India is intent on doing this, and why India will continue to do this, because China has made it virtually impossible for India to have a positive engagement in the short to medium term with China, unless China changes its track. And that has been the position ever since this crisis broke out, being very, very explicitly laid out by India, that unless China shows its good faith intentions, in New Delhi would not be able to have a positive view of the relationship. New Delhi would not be able to take the relationship in a positive direction, and China should not expect India to take the relationship in a positive direction. And I think that's a message that perhaps has gone out and will shape this relationship for better or for worse.
Yeah, and India also, this is also will help in building on a strong relationship that India and Japan shared, especially during Shinzo Abe's tenure. He's been a great asset, a valuable G7 leader, has been a great friend of India. He's strengthened the Indo-Pacific architecture. He's revived the Quad. So it also builds on that and in a way improves the relationship between India and Japan. But we look at Afghanistan and the intra-Afghan dialogue that's taking place in Doha, for which a top Indian official actually flew down from Delhi, and Foreign Minister Jay Shankar attended it virtually, whereas the February US Taliban talk that took place, we know that the ambassador in Qatar attended it. How significant is this, given the reticence India has had about the power sharing arrangement in Afghanistan?
I think this is a reflection of the changing realities on the ground in Afghanistan, and that India, it is both. In a sense, it is also at the same time a recognition that any arrangement that Afghanistan works out for itself, India will have a role there, because of India's stakes, in what happens in Afghanistan, and because of in some ways Afghanistan's stakes in how India perceives it. After all, India is the largest aid donor, India is the largest investor, India has been such a critical part of the evolution of modern Afghan state in the last few decades. And I think that sense is there in all stakeholders. Some say it explicitly, some don't. And now the Taliban are beginning to see themselves as part of the of a power structure there, of governance structure there. They also recognize that India will have to be on board because India has enough equities there which have to be maintained. And if your intent is not simply to destroy Pakistan, then you have to involve India in the mix, because Pakistan simply is not going to fill the void. So in that context, I think India's approach has been in the past that India had been cagey about engaging with the Taliban, though India and the Taliban have been engaging here and there unofficially. But I think direct engagement has been relatively limited. Now I think India also recognizes the changing realities. There is a recognition about India's position there. So there is a reciprocal understanding that India will have to be part of this engagement. But I think the challenge is something that the Afghan stakeholders will have to resolve first amongst themselves before they, actually talk of other stakeholders. And that's why Indian intervention was interesting, because India, of course, talked about this process being Afghan-owned and Afghan-led. But India also mentioned some of the fundamental red lines in terms of minority rights, women's rights, human rights issues, which are going to be critical, because that's the fundamental dividing line. In some ways, you see the representation of women on one side being very significant versus on the other absent. Taliban does not have any women representative. So clearly, I think the agenda in some ways at this point seems irreconcilable, given that the two entities, the Afghan government and the Taliban, come from very different vantage points. But I think that's where Indian intervention, the intervention of other stakeholders, is important to remind all the stakeholders in the intra-Afghan dialogue process that it's not, the idea is not simply to have some kind of a power structure. The idea is to have a particular kind of power structure that allows voices that are marginalized, that are weaker sections of the societies, that are, like women, like other minorities, to have a voice in the decision-making process as the democracy of Afghanistan evolves. And I think that's a very important point that India should be prioritizing, and India has prioritized, as well as other stakeholders like Europeans, like Americans. They have also been talking about this. So we'll see how it evolves.
So Harsh, like you said, India has made its position very clear, also said that the Afghan soil should not be used for anti-India activities. Now, if we look at America, a new book has come out, Bob Woodward's Rage. And the big question is, how will it affect the US election? Is it really bad publicity for President Donald Trump, considering he's on record 13 times and actually calling out his own lies? Or do you think any publicity is good publicity?
Well, I think for Mr. Trump, being in the news cycle as he is, as he has been in the news cycle over the last few weeks, that remains, a constant pattern in the way that all the books that have emerged, or most of the books that have emerged, have not really painted a very rosy portrait of Mr. Trump. So I think this is another book in that line. What is most significant about, I think, this book is the comment on coronavirus, which I think, given Mr. Trump's back and forth on this issue, the fact that this book clearly reveals that he was aware of the seriousness of the crisis way back in February, I think might underscore for some his propensity to use even a crisis of this magnitude to his electoral advantage, and that may not go down very well. But again, whether it changes the fundamental dynamic of the electoral of these elections, I don't think so. I think those who are already convinced that he's not the one that they would vote for, this would further reinforce their perception, and his base would certainly revel in the fact that he remains contrarian. He remains for someone who challenges the established order, and I think it's very unlikely that it will have a major impact on that. But I think it broadly, this, his response to coronavirus question tells you that his, again, something that we have known for some time, that his governance abilities remain quite poor, and that he, from the very beginning, was unsure how to use this crisis, or how to manage this crisis, whether he should take electoral advantage of this, or whether he should govern this as based on science and larger administrative infrastructure. So I think this is something that comes out, especially in the present context where America is still struggling to come out of this crisis. This will become a very, very big bone of contention, both between his proponents and his opponents, as well as it will fuel this larger debate about his governance abilities.
Absolutely. That's a very important and a very interesting point, that it may actually not affect his re-election prospects at all. But that's it from us on this week, Ideas Factory. See you next week.